Imagine walking through the damp, crowded streets of London or Amsterdam in the early 1700s. The air is thick with the smell of coal smoke, river mud, and baking bread. Nailed to a wooden post, still smelling of fresh, coarse ink, is a sheet of paper that draws a small crowd. It's not an advertisement for a Shakespearean play or a public concert. It's a broadside, printed in bold, dramatic letters, announcing a public event of a very different kind. It promises the dissection of the notorious pirate, Captain Thomas Vale, hanged at dawn just yesterday for his crimes upon the high seas. The poster declares that for the price of a few shillings, the public is invited to witness the celebrated anatomist, Dr. Willem Brandt, reveal the intricate secrets of the human form. It is advertised as a lesson in both science and morality, a spectacle where God's perfect design would be unveiled from within the corrupted vessel of a wicked man. This was not a back alley affair. It was a civic event, a blockbuster attraction for which you could buy a ticket. Before we start, a quick roll call. Write in the comments which part of this planet you're watching from, and then just listen and enjoy. This strange intersection of justice, science, and public spectacle raises a profound question that feels almost alien to us now. How did the solemn act of anatomical study, a cornerstone of modern medicine, transform into a form of public entertainment and simultaneously a final, terrifying punishment for the condemned? Over the course of our journey together, we will step into these anatomical theaters. We will explore the laws that sanction this practice, turning the surgeon's scalpel into both a tool of discovery and an instrument of the state. We will meet the anatomist performers who commanded the stage and the silent, unwilling subjects upon their tables. And we will try to understand the moment in history when seeing a human body taken apart was considered a perfectly reasonable, even enlightening, way to spend an afternoon. This was a world where the curtain rose not on actors, but on a corpse, and the drama that unfolded was the systematic mapping of our own interior. To truly grasp this phenomenon, we must first adjust our perspective. We must shed our modern sensibilities about the privacy and sanctity of the body after death. In the 17th and 18th centuries, death was a far more public and frequent affair. Executions themselves were highly ritualized public events, meant to serve as a stark warning. The journey of the condemned to the gallows was a parade, their final words a form of public theater. The dissection, then, was simply the epilogue to this grim play. It was an extension of the state's power beyond the final breath, a declaration that even in death, the criminal's body was not their own. It belonged to the crown, to the surgeons, and to the curious public who paid to see it. Think of the atmosphere inside one of these specially designed theaters. They were often circular, with steep, tiered wooden benches rising up around a central marble slab, much like a miniature Roman Colosseum. The architecture itself was a statement. This was not a hidden laboratory. It was a stage for a grand performance. Light, often from a large central skylight, would illuminate the proceedings with a stark, unforgiving clarity. The audience was a curious mix. There were earnest medical students, of course, sketching furiously in their notebooks, trying to memorize the layout of muscles and organs. But seated beside them were artists, hungry for the anatomical knowledge that would allow them to render the human form with lifelike precision. There were also aristocrats and wealthy merchants, treating the event as a fashionable and intellectual diversion. And among them, ordinary citizens, drawn in by a potent cocktail of morbid curiosity, a desire for education, and the thrill of the taboo. It was a social gathering, a place to see and be seen, all centered around the silent, pale figure on the table. The anatomist himself was the star. He was not merely a technician, but a master of ceremonies. He would enter, often in fine academic robes, his polished instruments laid out neatly beside him. He would command the room with his voice, explaining each incision, each revealed organ, with a mixture of scientific precision and dramatic flair. He might quote classical poets on the frailty of the human body, or offer a sermon on the wages of sin, all while his hands performed their meticulous, grisly work. This was the anatomy of spectacle. The procedure itself was a deliberate multi-day ritual. First, the abdomen would be opened, as the organs within it, the liver, the stomach, the intestines, were the quickest to decay. This was the dirty part of the dissection. The next day might be devoted to the chest, revealing the heart and lungs, the seats of passion and life. Finally, the limbs and the brain would be explored, the very structures of action and thought. Each step was a revelation, turning the abstract idea of a human into a tangible, observable machine of flesh, bone, and fluid. The promise of the broadside was being fulfilled. The audience was seeing the inner workings of a man, a pirate no less, whose life of chaos and violence was now being brought into a world of cold, rational order by the surgeon's knife. This wasn't just a scientific demonstration. It was a powerful narrative about civilization taming the savage, about reason triumphing over chaos, and about the ultimate authority of the law over the individual. The body on the table was more than just a source of knowledge. It was a symbol. Its public dismantling was the final act of erasure, a punishment designed to be more terrifying than death itself. For many, the fear was not of the hangman's noose, but of the anatomist's blade that waited afterward. It was a fear rooted in the deep-seated belief that one's body needed to be whole to be resurrected on Judgment Day. To be dissected was to risk not just earthly humiliation, but eternal damnation. So, as the crowd filed out of the theater at the end of the day, their heads filled with newfound knowledge and unsettling images, they left behind not just a collection of dissected parts, but the ghost of an idea. The idea that a human body could be a book, a map, a moral lesson, and a thrilling show, all at the same time. The curtain had fallen on the corpse, but the questions it raised would echo through the centuries, forcing us to confront the uncomfortable and often contradictory ways we have sought to understand ourselves, our mortality, and the very meaning of what it is to be human. That spectacle in the anatomical theater, with its paying audience and celebrity professor, was not born from a simple desire for morbid entertainment. It was the strange, public flowering of a deep and desperate hunger. To understand why society would turn the dissection of a human being into a public event, we have to look beneath the floorboards of the theater, into the lecture halls and universities of a Europe that was waking up from a long intellectual slumber. The story begins not with a criminal, but with a scholar and a revolutionary book. For over 1,000 years, the study of the human body in Europe had been dominated by the ghost of one man, Galen of Pergamon, a physician from the Roman Empire. His texts were treated as infallible scripture. Medical professors would read from Galen's work aloud, while a lowly barber surgeon made the incisions, often on the body of an animal, as human dissection was largely forbidden. The professor's hands remained clean. His mind remained rooted in the distant past. Then in the mid-16th century, a young Flemish anatomist named Andreas Vesalius did something radical. He decided to look for himself. He rejected the second-hand knowledge of the ancients and relied on the evidence of his own eyes and his own hands. At great personal risk, he obtained human bodies and performed meticulous dissections, discovering that Galen, who had based much of his work on apes and pigs, had been wrong about hundreds of points of human anatomy. In 1543, Vesalius published his masterpiece, De Humani Corporis Fabrica, on the fabric of the human body. It was a work of breathtaking beauty and scientific rigor, filled with intricate, accurate woodcut illustrations of muscles, skeletons, and organs. It was a declaration of independence for medical science. It said, "Do not trust the old books. Trust what you can see and touch." This single book lit a fire across Europe. A new generation of physicians, surgeons, and artists was suddenly possessed by an urgent need to understand the true structure of the human body. The age of anatomy had dawned, but this new, voracious appetite for knowledge immediately collided with a formidable and ancient wall, a severe, chronic, and desperate shortage of human bodies for study. The demand created by Vesalius's revolution was immense. Universities in Padua, Leiden, Paris, and London were swelling with students who now expected and needed to learn from direct observation. Yet the legal supply of cadavers was almost non-existent. A typical medical school with hundreds of students might be fortunate to obtain 1 or 2 bodies a year for a public dissection. Imagine trying to learn surgery, to understand the intricate pathways of nerves and blood vessels that mean the difference between life and death, based on a single, fleeting demonstration. It was like trying to learn the geography of an entire continent by glancing at one page of an atlas. This scarcity created an environment of intense frustration. Professors were unable to teach effectively. Surgeons were operating with a dangerously incomplete map of the human interior. The progress ignited by Vesalius was sputtering for a simple lack of fuel, the very bodies that science so desperately needed to explore. So why was the supply so tragically limited? The answer lies not in a lack of dead bodies, but in a profound and deeply ingrained set of cultural and religious beliefs about what a body is for, especially after death. For centuries, Christian doctrine had emphasized the sanctity of the body as a vessel for the soul, created in the image of God. More importantly, it held as a central tenet the belief in the physical resurrection of the body on Judgment Day. The assumption was that on that final day, the body would need to be whole and intact in its grave to be raised again. Dissection, therefore, was not seen as a neutral scientific procedure. It was seen as a profound act of mutilation and desecration. It was an act that could potentially jeopardize one's eternal salvation. This belief was not the exclusive domain of theologians. It was a visceral, powerful conviction held by ordinary people. The thought of a loved one's body being cut apart on a slab was a source of genuine horror. It violated the sacred duty of the living to protect the dead and ensure their peaceful rest until the final trumpet sounded. This created a powerful social taboo. To willingly give a body to the anatomists was almost unthinkable. And for the authorities to take a body against the family's wishes was to invite outrage and social unrest. This put the church and the burgeoning scientific community on a direct collision course. On one hand, you had the spiritual imperative to protect the integrity of the dead for the sake of the soul. On the other hand, you had the scientific and humanitarian imperative to understand the body to save the lives of the living. Time 1.2s. How could a surgeon learn to safely remove a bladder stone, or amputate a gangrenous limb, or deliver a child during a difficult birth, without ever having explored the tissues and structures involved? The knowledge that could prevent suffering was locked away inside the very thing that society was determined to protect from investigation. This was the anatomy of need, a burning desire for empirical knowledge, clashing with a deeply held faith in the sacredness of the flesh. A solution, or rather a grim compromise, had to be found. If the bodies of the righteous and the ordinary were off limits, protected by a fortress of faith and family, then science would have to turn to those who had forfeited that protection. The state, which needed skilled doctors for its armies and growing cities, and the universities, which were crying out for teaching materials, began to look towards the margins of society. They looked toward the gallows. They began to see the bodies of executed criminals not just as the remnants of a life lived in sin, but as a new and vital resource. It was here, in this desperate need, that the seeds of dissection as a formal punishment were sown. It was a way to feed the engine of science without offending the sensibilities of the general populace, by using the bodies of those deemed unworthy of society's ultimate protection. The grand theater of dissection was, at its heart, a solution to a supply chain crisis. It was the visible, dramatic result of a society grappling with two of its most powerful impulses: the quest for knowledge and the reverence for the dead. The desperate need for cadavers and the deep-seated fear of dissection created a volatile social equation. A solution was needed that could serve the ambitions of science while upholding the authority of the state. That solution arrived not in the form of a scientific breakthrough, but as a chilling piece of legislation. It was a law that formally transformed the surgeon's scalpel into an instrument of post-mortem punishment, a law that would haunt the gallows and shape the public perception of anatomy for a century. The most infamous and influential of these laws was Britain's Murder Act of 1752. On the surface, the act was designed to address the rising rates of murder by making the punishment for it more terrifying. But its most revolutionary clause was not about the act of execution itself. It was about what happened after. The act stipulated that the body of a convicted murderer was no longer the property of their family. It did not belong to the church for a sacred burial. Instead, the act decreed that the corpse must be delivered directly from the gallows to the surgeon's hall for dissection and anatomization. In some cases, as an alternative, the body could be hung in chains, left to rot in a public gibbet as a gruesome, decomposing warning. But for the most part, the destination was the anatomist's table. This was a stroke of grim legislative genius. The state had recognized the populace's profound dread of dissection and weaponized it. They understood that for many, the horror of being cut apart, of having one's body desecrated and denied a Christian burial, was a fear that transcended death itself. The law, therefore, created what was effectively a punishment beyond death. It was an official declaration that the penalty for the most heinous crime was not just the forfeiture of life, but the forfeiture of bodily integrity, and, in the popular imagination, the forfeiture of a peaceful afterlife. The law's language was clear and intended to instill terror. The judge, upon sentencing a murderer, was required to pronounce this additional sentence of dissection in open court, ensuring the condemned and the public fully understood the fate that awaited the body. This legal framework was what one historian has called the butcher's bill. It was the price paid by the condemned for the advancement of medical science. The law effectively turned the bodies of a specific class of people, executed criminals, who were almost invariably poor and marginalized, into a state-sanctioned, legally protected resource. It created a direct pipeline from the gallows to the anatomy theater. While the Murder Act was specifically for murderers, the principle it established had a much wider effect. It cemented the association between dissection and criminality, between shame and the pursuit of anatomical knowledge. This legal link had profound consequences. Firstly, it reinforced the social stigma attached to dissection. By making it a punishment for the worst of sinners, it made it even more unthinkable for any respectable, law-abiding family to consider donating a body to science. Who would want their loved one to suffer the same fate as a notorious murderer? This, paradoxically, ensured that the supply of bodies remained restricted to the executed, making the law a self-fulfilling prophecy. It guaranteed that anatomy would be fed almost exclusively by the unworthy dead. Secondly, it transformed the role of the surgeon in the public eye. Anatomists were no longer just men of science. They became, by extension, agents of the state's justice system. They were the final executioners, carrying out the ultimate part of the sentence. This created a complicated and often tense relationship. While surgeons desperately needed the bodies the law provided, they were also participating in a system that made their profession appear ghoulish and predatory in the eyes of the poor. In cities with major medical schools like London and Edinburgh, the day of an execution became a scene of high drama that didn't end with the drop of the gallows. As soon as the condemned was pronounced dead, a frantic and often violent struggle would ensue. The family and friends of the deceased, desperate to save the body from the surgeons, would clash with the anatomist's assistants, who were legally empowered to claim their prize. Riots were not uncommon. The crowd would surge forward, attempting to spirit the body away for a secret burial, while the surgeon's men, sometimes armed with clubs, fought to secure their valuable specimen. This grim tug-of-war over a cooling corpse, played out at the foot of the gallows, was a direct result of a law that pitted the needs of science against the deepest emotional and spiritual instincts of the people. It was a visceral display of the conflict between the state's authority and the community's desire for dignity in death. Consider the logic of the state. It solved multiple problems at once. It provided a powerful deterrent to crime. It satisfied the growing and influential medical establishment by providing them with crucial teaching material. And it did so without having to challenge the powerful religious and social taboos surrounding the bodies of the decent citizenry. The law created a clear, brutal hierarchy of the dead. The bodies of the respectable were to be protected, mourned, and laid to rest in consecrated ground. The bodies of the condemned were a raw material, a commodity to be exploited for the public good. This legal framework explains why the anatomy theater became a public spectacle. If dissection was part of a public punishment, then it followed that it should be witnessed by the public. Just as the execution was a public display of justice, the subsequent dissection was a public display of the consequences of crime, a final lesson etched into the very flesh of the lawbreaker. The law gave the proceedings a veneer of civic purpose. It wasn't just morbid curiosity, it was a demonstration of the rule of law, a final, emphatic statement that society had total power over the individual, even after death. The butcher's bill was, in essence, a social contract written in blood and law. The state would provide the bodies that science needed to progress, and in return, science would lend its prestige and its methods to the state's system of punishment. It was a dark, pragmatic alliance that defined the golden age of the public anatomy lesson, ensuring that the man on the marble slab was not just a subject of scientific inquiry, but a silent testament to the long and powerful reach of the law. The public dissection was not an event that could happen just anywhere. It required a very specific kind of space, a building designed not just for scientific procedure, but for performance and observation. The architecture of the anatomical theater is a story in itself, a tale of how physical structures can shape and reflect the values of an era. These buildings were the stone and timber wombs that birthed modern anatomy, and their design tells us everything about how the act of looking at the dead was framed as a grand, significant, and thoroughly public event. To step into one of these theaters was to leave the chaotic city street behind and enter a world of order, reason, and stark focus. The most influential design was that of the Theatrum Anatomicum of Leiden University, built in the Netherlands in the late 16th century. It wasn't housed in a sterile medical facility, but in a converted chapel, a detail that speaks volumes about the quasi-religious gravity of the proceedings. The Leiden Theater established the template that would be copied across Europe. It was a steep, circular, or elliptical arena. The design was entirely democratic in its sightlines, but profoundly hierarchical in its structure. At the very bottom, in the brightly lit center, was the dissection table. The stage, radiating upwards from this focal point, were concentric rings of steep wooden benches, rising in tiers almost to the ceiling. It was a design borrowed directly from the classical Roman amphitheater or Colosseum, a space built for spectacle, for the focused attention of a crowd upon a central action. This was no accident. The architecture deliberately framed the dissection not as a private somber study, but as a public drama. Every seat had a clear, unobstructed view of the body on the table. There was nowhere to hide. The gaze of the audience was relentlessly directed downwards, onto the methodical unveiling of the human interior. This design served a practical purpose, of course. It allowed a large number of students and spectators to witness the intricate work of the anatomist. But the psychological effect was just as important. The tiered seating created a sense of collective participation. Everyone was looking at the same thing from a slightly different angle, their shared focus creating an intense, charged atmosphere. The circular shape meant that spectators were not just looking at the dissection, they were also looking at each other. They could see the expressions of awe, concentration, or revulsion on the faces of those opposite them. It was a communal experience, a shared journey into the forbidden landscape of the human body. Let's take a tour of another famous example, the anatomical theater of the Arciginazio of Padua, built in 1594. This theater, the oldest surviving of its kind, is a marvel of wooden construction, a beautiful and somewhat claustrophobic space. Carved from fragrant spruce and larch, its 6 elliptical tiers could hold around 200 people, packed tightly together. The experience here would have been incredibly intimate. The spectators were so close to the action that they could likely smell the preservatives, hear the quiet scrape of the scalpel on bone, and see the subtle shifts in tissue color under the anatomist's hands. The lighting in Padua was especially dramatic. The room itself was dark, with the only illumination coming from candles held by students in the first ring and a chandelier suspended directly over the dissection table. This created a powerful chiaroscuro effect, much like a Caravaggio painting. The body and the anatomist's hands would be bathed in a pool of brilliant light, while the audience sat in tiered rings of shadow. This wasn't just practical, it was theatrical. It heightened the drama, focusing all attention on the illuminated corpse and turning the rest of the world to darkness. The architecture also worked to manage the sensory experience. The procedures could be long, lasting several days, and the smell of a decomposing body in a crowded, unventilated room would have been overpowering. Some theaters, like Leiden's, were only used in the cold winter months to slow decay. Others had specific design features, like windows in the cupola that could be opened to provide some ventilation. But often, the air would be thick with scented herbs and pomanders carried by the audience members to mask the odor. The very structure of the room, with its intense focus and shared discomfort, contributed to the unique character of the event, a blend of intellectual enlightenment and visceral endurance. These theaters were also temples to the new science of anatomy. They were often decorated with symbols and skeletons that reinforced the gravity of their purpose. The Leiden Theater, for example, displayed articulated human and animal skeletons in its off-season. Some posed in contemplative stances and holding banners with philosophical mottos like Memento Mori, "Remember, you must die," or "Nocite ipsum," "Know thyself." This transformed the space from a mere lecture hall into a cabinet of curiosities and a philosophical meditation on life and death. The skeletons served as a permanent audience, a silent Greek chorus reminding the living of their own mortality. The architecture, therefore, did more than just house the dissection. It curated the experience. It elevated the procedure from a messy, odorous task into a significant cultural ritual. By placing it in a space that recalled both the classical gravitas of the Roman Forum and the focused devotion of a church, it gave the act of cutting up a human body an intellectual and moral legitimacy. It declared to the world that what was happening here was not butchery. It was a profound act of discovery. The building itself was an argument, It argued for the importance of empirical knowledge. It argued for the power of human reason to peel back the mysteries of creation. And it argued that the body of a condemned criminal could be redeemed. Its ignominious end transformed into a source of universal enlightenment for all who had a ticket to watch. When the great anatomist sat on his high-backed chair, or cathedra, and directed the dissection, he was not just a professor in a classroom. He was a high priest of science, presiding over a ceremony in a temple designed specifically for his rites. The architecture provided the sacred geometry for a new kind of knowledge, one that had to be seen to be believed. And for the price of admission, anyone could come inside, take a seat on the steep wooden benches, and watch as the hidden architecture of the human body was revealed in the bright, unforgiving light of the stage. At the very center of this architectural stage, under the intense gaze of hundreds of spectators, stood a figure of immense authority and charisma, the professor of anatomy. This was not a role for the timid or the dull. The great anatomists of this era were much more than just men of science. They were scholars, civic leaders, and, perhaps most importantly, consummate performers. They had to command not only the intricacies of the human body, but also the rapt attention of a diverse and demanding audience. To succeed, they had to be part showman, part priest, and part scientist, blending meticulous technical skill with the art of dramatic presentation. Consider the challenge they faced. Their primary subject, the human corpse, was silent, passive, and, as the days wore on, increasingly unpleasant. Their task was to animate this inert subject, to make it speak, to turn its silent tissues and organs into a compelling story about life, design, and mortality. The tools for this were not just the scalpel and the probe, but also rhetoric, gesture, and a carefully cultivated stage presence. The professor was the narrator of this macabre drama, the voice that guided the audience's eyes and minds through the complex landscape of the body. One of the most famous of these anatomist performers was Dr. Nicolaes Tulp, immortalized in Rembrandt's 1632 masterpiece, The Anatomy Lesson of Dr. Nicolaes Tulp. In the painting, Tulp is not depicted as a withdrawn researcher, but as a confident public figure. He is dressed in the sober but expensive black clothing of a Dutch regent, his hat firmly on his head, a symbol of his high social standing. He is not performing the dissection himself. That task is for a lesser surgeon. But he is demonstrating, using forceps to lift the flexor muscles of the executed criminal's forearm, explaining the mechanics of the hand to the enraptured surgeons of the Amsterdam Guild who surround him. His expression is one of calm, intellectual authority. He is the master of this domain, translating the silent text of the body for his audience. This division of labor was common. The professor often stood or sat in a high chair, the cathedra, reading from an anatomical text, at first Galen, later Vesalius, or his own notes, and directing a lower status barber surgeon, or demonstrator, who performed the actual incisions. This maintained the professor's dignity, keeping his hands clean and his focus on intellectual instruction. However, the more revolutionary anatomists, following Vesalius's example, insisted on performing the dissection themselves, uniting the intellectual and the manual labor, and, in doing so, elevating the status of the procedure itself. Regardless of who held the knife, the professor's spoken performance was key. His lecture was the soundtrack to the visual spectacle. He would begin with a formal oration, often in Latin, praising the wonders of God's creation and perhaps making a moral point about the wretched life of the criminal on the table. This framed the event with a sense of high purpose. As the dissection proceeded, his tone would shift. He would become a guide, pointing out the elegant curve of a rib, the intricate branching of a nerve, the remarkable structure of the heart. He would use analogies and metaphors to make the complex understandable, comparing the valves of the veins to the floodgates of a canal, or the chambers of the eye to a camera obscura. This was not a dry recitation of facts. It was a live, improvisational performance. A skilled anatomist could read his audience. He would know when to pause for dramatic effect, when to inject a moment of philosophical reflection, and when to lighten the mood with a touch of academic wit. He had to engage everyone in the room, from the dedicated medical students in the front row to the curious socialites in the upper tiers who might be more interested in the thrill than the science. The celebrity status of these men was very real. Figures like Herman Boerhaave in Leiden or William Hunter in London became European sensations. Their public dissections were major events, drawing international crowds. Students flocked from across the continent to study under them. Their names appeared in newspapers, and their portraits were engraved and sold. They were pioneers, pushing the boundaries of knowledge, and the public was fascinated by them. They were, in a sense, the rock stars of the scientific world. Dr. William Hunter, for example, built his own private anatomy theater in London in the 1760s, a testament to his success and influence. His lectures were legendary, known for their clarity, elegance, and the extraordinary quality of his anatomical preparations. He was a master showman, using injections of colored wax to highlight the vascular system, turning a gray and confusing mass of tissue into a vibrant, color-coded map. This was both a brilliant teaching tool and a stunning visual spectacle. The professor's performance was not without its pressures and controversies. He was always working against the clock. Decay was his constant enemy, forcing a strict, multi-day schedule and lending an air of urgency to the proceedings. He also had to manage the ethical and social tensions inherent in the act. He was dissecting a human being, often someone known to the local community, in front of a paying crowd. He had to maintain a careful balance, projecting an air of sober scientific detachment while simultaneously satisfying the audience's hunger for a spectacle. He had to be respectful enough to avoid charges of barbarism, yet engaging enough to sell tickets. The professor's performance, therefore, was a delicate dance on a razor's edge. He stood at the intersection of life and death, science and society, education and entertainment. With his words and gestures, he transformed a reviled criminal corpse into a vessel of sublime knowledge. He turned a dreaded punishment into a celebrated civic event. He took the audience on a journey from revulsion to wonder, showing them that beneath the skin, we are all, as the saying went, fearfully and wonderfully made. In the end, the professor as performer was the essential catalyst. Without his commanding presence, the anatomical theater would have been nothing more than a charnel house. It was his voice, his intellect, and his showmanship that filled the space with meaning, turning the grim reality of the dissection table into a luminous stage for the drama of human discovery. If the professor was the star performer and the corpse the silent subject, then the audience was the crucial third element, the force that gave the entire spectacle its purpose and its unique electric atmosphere. An anatomy theater filled with spectators was a microcosm of its society, a place where the highest aspirations of the Enlightenment met the most primal human curiosities. To understand the event, we have to imagine ourselves among them, finding a seat on a hard wooden bench and looking down at the stage. Who were these people? What drew them here? And what was it like to be an audience with the dead? The crowd was a surprisingly diverse cross-section of urban life, a mixture of the professional, the privileged, and the simply curious. The core of the audience, of course, was made up of medical students and members of the Surgeons Guild. For them, this was not entertainment. It was a rare and precious educational opportunity. Crowded into the front rows, they would be sketching furiously, their notebooks filled with detailed drawings of muscles, bones, and organ systems. They were there to learn the map of the human body, a map they would soon have to navigate with their own scalpels on living patients. Their concentration would have been intense, their presence lending a serious academic air to the proceedings. Seated near them, often with their own sketchbooks, would be artists. For painters and sculptors of the Renaissance and Baroque periods, a deep understanding of anatomy was not an option. It was essential to depict the human form with realism and emotional power. To paint a suffering saint or a heroic warrior, an artist needed to know what lay beneath the skin. They needed to understand how muscles attached to bone, how tension in a limb would manifest on the surface. Public dissections were their primary, and often only, source for this direct knowledge. Figures like Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci were known to have attended dissections, and the anatomical precision in their work is a direct testament to what they learned in these theaters. Their presence elevated the event, framing it not just as a medical lesson, but as a pursuit of aesthetic and philosophical truth. Then there were the intellectuals and the aristocrats. For the educated elite, attending a dissection was a fashionable and intellectually stimulating activity. It was a demonstration of the power of human reason, a front row seat to the great scientific revolution that was reshaping their world. It was a topic for conversation in salons and coffee houses. To have attended the latest anatomy lecture by a famous professor was a mark of being modern, of being part of the forward-thinking vanguard of society. They came not just to learn, but to be seen learning, to participate in the great cultural project of enlightenment. Their presence, in their fine clothes and powdered wigs, added a layer of social prestige to the macabre proceedings. And finally, there were the ordinary citizens. For a fee, anyone could buy a ticket. This is perhaps the most surprising aspect for the modern mind. A public dissection was a commercial enterprise. The money from ticket sales was often used to pay for the upkeep of the theater, the professor's salary, and the cost of the executioner who provided the body. Printed guides or pamphlets were sometimes sold at the door, outlining the schedule of the multi-day dissection and providing diagrams to help the layperson follow along. This commercial aspect tells us that the event held a powerful appeal for the general public. What was that appeal? It was a complex blend of motivations. Morbid curiosity was undoubtedly a major factor. The interior of the human body was a forbidden territory, a place of ultimate mystery. The dissection offered a chance to gaze upon the taboo, to see with one's own eyes the hidden machinery of life. It was a thrill, a spectacle that promised sights that were both horrifying and fascinating. The fact that the body belonged to a notorious criminal only added to the drama. It was a chance to see the physical remains of a figure from the headlines, to witness the final chapter in a story of crime and punishment. But it would be a mistake to dismiss the audience's interest as purely ghoulish. There was also a genuine thirst for knowledge. In an age before widespread scientific education, the anatomy theater was one of the few places where a layperson could learn about the workings of their own body. It was a form of public education, a live documentary. The professor's lecture made the spectacle comprehensible, turning a confusing mass of flesh and blood into an ordered, understandable system. The atmosphere inside the theater was therefore a unique and strange cocktail of emotions and attitudes. There was the hushed concentration of the students, the intellectual curiosity of the philosophers, and the wide-eyed wonder and revulsion of the general public. There was the smell of scented pomanders fighting a losing battle against the odor of decay. There was the formal, authoritative voice of the professor, punctuated by the gasps or murmurs of the crowd as a new organ was revealed. It was a social gathering, but one centered on a profound and unsettling subject. People might greet acquaintances, exchange pleasantries, and then turn their full attention to the systematic dismembering of a human being. This ability to hold both social normalcy and profound strangeness in the same space is a hallmark of the era. The event was not seen as contradictory. It was simply the way things were done. The economics of the spectacle were also a driving force. The demand for tickets could be so high that some dissections were repeated, with different parts of the body being demonstrated to different sold-out crowds. The body of a particularly famous criminal was a box office draw. The business that grew around these events, the ticket sellers, the pamphlet printers, the guards, was a small but significant part of the urban economy. The corpse had become a commodity, and its unveiling was a profitable performance. So, as we sit in our imaginary seat, we realize that the audience is not a passive observer. They are active participants. Their presence legitimizes the event. Their money funds it. Their diverse interests, scientific, artistic, philosophical, and sensational, are what create the demand that keeps the system running. They are the reason the theater exists. To be an audience with the dead was to be part of a complex cultural machine, one that processed the bodies of the condemned into knowledge, art, entertainment, and a powerful statement about social order. Now, let us turn our gaze from the audience and focus on the central act itself. Let's move past the philosophy, the architecture, and the economics, and stand at the edge of the marble slab. What actually happened during a public dissection? The process was not a haphazard exploration, but a highly structured, multi-day ritual, a methodical journey from the exterior to the interior, governed by both scientific logic and the relentless timetable of decay. This was the ritual of unveiling, the systematic transformation of a human body into a map of anatomical knowledge. The procedure would typically begin on the day after the execution, or sometimes even just a few hours later, to ensure the specimen was as fresh as possible. The body, stripped bare, would be laid out on the table, often positioned with its head slightly lowered to allow fluids to drain away from the primary areas of interest. Before the first incision was made, the professor would often deliver a formal introduction, a preamble that set the stage for the days to come. He might comment on the physique of the deceased, linking their muscularity or frailty to their life of crime, weaving a moral narrative into the physical facts before him. The first day was almost universally dedicated to the abdomen. There was a very practical reason for this. The organs of the belly, the stomach, the intestines, the liver, and the spleen are the quickest to decompose. They are filled with bacteria and digestive fluids that begin to break down the tissues almost immediately after death. This process, called putrefaction, produces foul-smelling gases and discoloration, and it had to be dealt with first. So, the anatomist, or his demonstrator, would make the first grand incision, a long cut from the sternum down to the pubic bone, followed by a transverse cut across the abdomen. The flaps of skin and muscle would be peeled back, like opening the cover of a book, to reveal the abdominal cavity. This was often the most shocking moment for the audience, the first time the sealed interior of the body was breached and its contents exposed to the air and light of the theater. One by one, the professor would point to the organs: the great dark mass of the liver, the pale J-shaped bag of the stomach, the glistening coiled tubes of the small and large intestines. He would explain their functions as they were then understood: the liver producing bile, the stomach digesting food. He might have the demonstrator remove the organs, holding them up for the audience to see, perhaps even passing them around the front rows in a wooden bowl for closer inspection by the students. By the end of the first day, the abdominal cavity would be largely empty, its contents examined, discussed, and set aside. The second day was typically reserved for the chest or thorax. The demonstrator would saw through the ribs and sternum, lifting the entire chest plate away to reveal the thoracic cavity. Here lay the organs considered the seat of life and emotion: the lungs and the heart. The professor would describe the spongy texture of the lungs, perhaps inflating them with a bellows to demonstrate their function. But the centerpiece of this day was always the heart. The anatomist would point out its four chambers, the great vessels, the aorta and vena cava, that entered and exited it, and the delicate valves that controlled the flow of blood. This was a moment of profound symbolism. The heart, long considered the source of courage, love, and the soul itself, was now revealed to be a muscle, a biological pump of incredible efficiency and design. For the audience, this was a powerful lesson in the mechanistic philosophy of the age, a demonstration that even the most poetic aspects of human existence had a physical, observable basis. The third day, and any subsequent days, would be dedicated to the more durable parts of the body. The limbs would be dissected, with the professor tracing the paths of muscles, nerves, and blood vessels from the shoulder to the fingertips, from the hip to the toes. Rembrandt's famous painting captures exactly this kind of demonstration, with Dr. Tulp explaining the musculature of the forearm that controls the hand. This was knowledge of immense practical value to surgeons who needed to know precisely where to cut and where to avoid. Finally, the anatomist would turn to the head. The scalp would be peeled back and the skull cap removed with a saw. This was the dramatic climax of the entire procedure, the unveiling of the human brain. The professor would carefully remove the brain, a soft, convoluted mass of gray and white matter, and describe its different parts: the cerebrum, the cerebellum, the brainstem. While the precise function of these areas was still poorly understood, the brain was revered as the seat of reason, memory, and identity. To see it held in the anatomist's hand was to witness the physical substance of human consciousness itself. The tools of the trade were simple but effective. They were not so different from a butcher's or a carpenter's toolkit. A variety of knives and scalpels for cutting, saws for bone, forceps for gripping, probes for tracing vessels, and ladles for scooping out fluids. The skill was not in the technology, but in the anatomist's hands, and in his encyclopedic knowledge of what he was looking for. After the soft tissues had been fully explored and removed, the work was still not done. The final stage was the preparation of the skeleton. The remaining flesh and cartilage would be boiled or scraped away from the bones. The bones would then be cleaned, dried, and carefully articulated, wired together to recreate the human skeleton in a standing or posed position. This skeleton, often the very skeleton of the criminal who had been dissected, would then be placed on display in the theater or a nearby museum. It served as a permanent teaching tool and a stark, final memento mori. The entire ritual, from the first cut to the final articulated skeleton, was a process of deconstruction and reconstruction. It took a named individual, a person with a story, and systematically turned them into a collection of anonymous, universal parts. The criminal ceased to be a specific man and became an example of man. His body was transformed from a vessel of sin into a text of scientific truth. This methodical, unpitying process was the very heart of the public dissection. It was a ritual designed to strip away the personal and reveal the universal, to turn the chaos of a human life into the ordered beauty of a biological machine. And it was this transformation that the audience paid to witness. We have spent our time in the theater, among the spectators and the professors. We have watched the methodical ritual of the dissection unfold. But in doing so, we have overlooked the most important person in the entire drama: the silent, unwilling subject on the marble table. To truly understand this history, we must leave the theater for a moment and stand in the cold, damp cell of the condemned. We must try to see this story from their perspective, to understand the journey from the gallows to the table. Who were these people? They were not, for the most part, the master criminals or romantic pirates of fiction. The vast majority of individuals executed and subsequently dissected were from the lowest rungs of the social ladder. They were laborers, beggars, discharged soldiers, and petty thieves, people living on the ragged edge of survival in the rapidly growing, often brutal, cities of early modern Europe. Their crimes, by our standards, were often shockingly minor. While the Murder Act of 1752 in Britain specifically condemned murderers to dissection in many places and at many times, the bodies of those executed for a wide range of capital offenses were also sent to the anatomists. Men and women could be hanged for grand larceny, which might mean stealing a sheep, a loaf of bread, or a piece of cloth worth more than a shilling. They were often people driven to crime by desperation, poverty, and a lack of any other option. Their lives were already marked by a profound lack of power and autonomy, and the final sentence of dissection was the ultimate expression of this powerlessness. Their bodies, which in life they had struggled to feed and shelter, were in death to be seized and used by the very society that had condemned them. Let us imagine the final days of such a person. Let's call him Thomas, a young man convicted of stealing a silver watch. From the moment the judge utters the final terrible words of the sentence, "And your body to be delivered to the surgeon's hall for anatomization," a new and specific kind of dread begins. This dread was often more potent than the fear of death itself. The hanging was a familiar horror, a public spectacle, but it was at least an end. The rope promised a moment of pain followed by oblivion. But dissection promised something else entirely. It promised a prolonged public desecration. It was a violation of the deepest-seated instincts for dignity and rest after a hard life. In the days leading up to the execution, this fear would be all-consuming. It fueled desperate escape attempts and impassioned pleas for clemency. But more often, it manifested in a desperate struggle to ensure a proper burial. Family and friends would gather, not just to offer comfort, but to conspire. They would plan how they might snatch the body from the authorities at the foot of the gallows. This was not just an act of love. It was seen as a sacred duty. To rescue the body from the surgeons was to save the soul of the condemned, to grant them the peace in death that they had never known in life. The final moments of the condemned were a public performance. The journey from the prison to the gallows, often in an open cart, was a slow procession through crowded streets. The crowd was not always hostile. There was often a current of sympathy for the condemned, especially if their crime was seen as a product of poverty. People might offer them drinks, a final human kindness. The condemned was expected to give a final speech from the gallows, a confession, a warning to others, or a declaration of innocence. This was their last chance to have a voice, to assert their identity before the state silenced them forever. And then came the hanging. After the body had hung for the prescribed amount of time, usually an hour, it would be cut down. This was the critical moment, the flashpoint for conflict. As the body fell to the ground, two groups would surge forward. The family and friends, desperate to claim their dead, and the officially sanctioned representatives of the surgeons, often referred to derisively as the surgeons' mob. The scene that followed was frequently a chaotic, violent brawl. Fists would fly, clubs would be wielded, and the corpse itself would become a prize in a grim tug of war. If the family was successful, they would whisk the body away to a secret, unmarked grave, burying it quickly before the authorities could intervene. But more often than not, the law was on the side of the surgeons. The body would be seized, loaded unceremoniously into a cart or a shell, and trundled away through the streets to the anatomy theater. For the deceased, this journey represented the final failure, the ultimate defeat. The last hope for a peaceful rest was gone. Once at the theater, the body of Thomas, the watch thief, would be stripped of its identity. He was no longer Thomas. He was the subject, or the specimen. His personal history, his struggles, his fears were irrelevant. His body was now a text to be read by the anatomist, a collection of tissues and structures to be demonstrated to the curious. The contrast between the intense, personal drama of his final days and the cold, impersonal objectivity of the dissection table could not be more stark. The body that had shivered in a cold cell, that had felt the terror of the noose, was now an object of detached scientific inquiry. The public's fear and hatred of this process were visceral and widespread. It was seen as a final, cruel indignity inflicted upon the poor. The rich, even if they were executed for crimes like treason, were almost always spared dissection. Their influential families could intervene, and their bodies would be returned for a private burial. This created a bitter class resentment. Dissection was a fate reserved for the powerless. It was a vivid reminder that in this society, even your body was not truly your own if you were poor. It belonged to the state and its institutions. This immense dread of dissection is the key to understanding the entire phenomenon. It was not a minor concern. It was a central, terrifying feature of the criminal justice system. It explains the riots at the gallows. It explains the desperate attempts to protect the graves of the dead. And it explains why the law was so effective as a deterrent. The state had found a punishment that tapped into the deepest spiritual and psychological fears of its populace. It was a form of terror that began long before death and extended far beyond it. So, when we picture the body on the table, we must remember that it was not an abstract specimen. It was the final destination of a journey that began with poverty, passed through the courtroom and the gallows, and ended in a blaze of public scrutiny. It was the body of a person whose final and most fervent wish for a quiet grave had been denied for the advancement of science and the enforcement of the law. The terror that the condemned felt, the riots at the gallows, the desperate efforts to reclaim a body, these were not just reactions to the physical act of being cut apart. They were fueled by a much deeper and more profound anxiety, one that touched upon the very nature of identity, the soul, and the promise of eternal life. To understand the full weight of the sentence of dissection, we must explore the philosophical and religious landscape of the time. We must ask, what was it about the surgeon's blade that was perceived as a threat not just to the body, but to the soul itself? At the heart of this fear was the widespread and deeply held Christian doctrine of the resurrection of the flesh. This was not a vague metaphorical belief. For the vast majority of people in the 17th and 18th centuries, from the poorest commoner to the most educated theologian, the promise of resurrection on Judgment Day was a literal, physical event. It was believed that on that final day, the archangel's trumpet would sound, the graves would open, and the bodies of the dead would be reconstituted, made whole and perfect again, to be reunited with their souls for eternal judgment. The body was not merely a disposable container for the spirit. It was an essential component of the complete human person, and its integrity was paramount for this final, glorious reunion. This belief was woven into the fabric of daily life, and most importantly, into the rituals of death. The Christian burial was a sacred act designed to protect the body and prepare it for this future event. The corpse was washed, shrouded, and laid to rest in consecrated ground, often facing east towards the rising sun, the direction from which Christ was expected to return. The funeral service, with its prayers and commendations, was a way of entrusting the body to God's care, a safekeeping until the resurrection. Every part of the ritual was designed to affirm the sanctity and wholeness of the physical form. Dissection, therefore, was seen as a direct and horrific assault on this sacred process. It was the ultimate desecration. The surgeon's blade did not just cut flesh. It tore apart the very vessel of salvation. To have one's body systematically dismantled, its organs removed, its bones boiled and wired into a skeleton for display. This was a horrifying violation of the natural and divine order. It was seen as a deliberate act of annihilation, a scattering of the self that would make the promised reassembly on Judgment Day difficult, if not impossible. How could God put you back together if your heart was in a jar in Leiden, your skin was tanned into leather in London, and your bones were wired to a stand in a dusty theater? While theologians might argue that an omnipotent God could, of course, reassemble a person from any state, this was a subtle point of doctrine that offered little comfort to the terrified populace. For them, the visual and visceral reality of dissection was a terrifying and seemingly irreversible act of destruction. It jeopardized one's chance at eternal life, replacing the promise of a glorious resurrection with the prospect of being a medical specimen for eternity. This fear created a philosophical crisis that the state and the scientific community had to navigate. How could they justify a practice that was seen as an affront to God and a danger to the soul? The solution was to construct a powerful moral and philosophical argument that effectively stripped the criminal's body of its sacred status. The logic went something like this: a person who committed a heinous crime, particularly murder, had not only violated the laws of man, but also the laws of God. Through their wicked actions, they had corrupted their own flesh, turning the temple of the soul into a vessel of sin. By doing so, they had forfeited their right to the sacred protections normally afforded to the dead. Their body was no longer entitled to the dignity of a Christian burial or the promise of a peaceful rest. This line of reasoning framed dissection not as a desecration, but as a just and fitting end for a corrupted body. It was a form of purification, a way for the corrupted flesh to serve a final moral purpose. By being used to advance medical knowledge, the criminal's body could, in a way, atone for the harm it had caused in life. It could help surgeons learn to save the lives of the innocent, thereby bringing a sliver of good out of a life of evil. The public anatomy lesson was thus presented as a moral play. The professor's opening oration would often touch on this theme, contrasting the wickedness of the deceased with the wondrous and divine design of the body that the dissection would reveal. The act of cutting open the sinner was portrayed as an act of revealing God's perfect creation, which the sinner himself had failed to honor. It was a powerful piece of rhetorical jujitsu. It turned a practice born of scientific necessity into an act of moral and theological significance. It allowed society to reconcile the competing demands of its faith and its reason. And yet, this official justification never fully quieted the deep popular anxieties. The fear of dissection remained a potent force. It highlights a fundamental tension in the Western view of the body. Is it a sacred object, a vessel for the soul with a destiny beyond the grave? Or is it a biological machine, a collection of tissues and organs that can be studied, understood, and used for the benefit of the living? The anatomy theater was the arena where this profound philosophical debate was played out not with words, but with a knife. The body on the table was the focal point of this conflict. To the anatomist, it was a magnificent machine, a puzzle to be solved. To the church, it was a fallen temple, still deserving of reverence. To the state, it was a tool of justice, a symbol of its ultimate power. And to the family of the deceased, it was a loved one, a person whose eternal fate now hung in the balance. The surgeon's blade, as it moved through flesh and bone, was tracing the fault lines of a culture grappling with the very meaning of the human body. It was separating not just muscle from bone, but one worldview from another. The scalpel was a philosophical instrument as much as a scientific one, and its sharp edge exposed the deep and unresolved questions about the relationship between our physical selves, our spiritual destinies, and the societies we build. While surgeons and students crowded the front rows of the anatomy theater for professional training, another group of spectators watched with a different kind of intensity. Seated slightly further back, with charcoal sticks and sketchbooks in hand, were the artists. For them, the theater was not just a place of scientific learning, but an essential, and often the only academy for understanding the human form. The magnificent flowering of realism in Western art, from the High Renaissance to the Baroque period, owes a profound and often unacknowledged debt to the silent, unwilling subjects on the dissection table. Art's debt to the dead is written in the lifelike muscles of Michelangelo's David, the expressive anatomy of a crucified Christ by Rubens, and most explicitly in the canvases of Rembrandt. Before the age of anatomy, artistic depictions of the human body were often stylized, symbolic, and anatomically naive. Artists worked from surface observation, classical sculptures, and pattern books. But with the scientific revolution sparked by Vesalius, a new standard emerged: anatomical truth. To be considered a master, an artist had to be able to render the body with convincing realism. They needed to know not just how a body looked, but how it worked. They needed to understand the skeleton that provided its structure, the muscles that produced its movement, and the way skin stretched and folded over the forms beneath. This knowledge was impossible to gain from a living model alone. The living model could hold a pose, but they could not reveal the engine within. For that, the artist had to go to the theater of the dead. Figures like Leonardo da Vinci were legendary for their private anatomical studies, secretly dissecting dozens of bodies to produce his breathtakingly accurate and beautiful anatomical drawings. But for most artists, who were not also scientific geniuses, the public dissection was their primary source. It was a rare opportunity to see the body's hidden architecture laid bare by an expert guide. They would sketch furiously, not just to capture the details of a specific organ or muscle group, but to understand the body as an integrated system. These sketches would become their reference library, the raw material they would later transform into scenes of high drama, religious devotion, and mythological grandeur. Perhaps no single work of art captures the relationship between art, science, and the public dissection more perfectly than Rembrandt's 1632 painting, The Anatomy Lesson of Dr. Nicolaas Tulp. This is more than just a painting. It is a historical document, a group portrait, and a profound meditation on the nature of seeing and knowing. The painting was commissioned by the Amsterdam Guild of Surgeons to commemorate their public dissection of that year. The subject on the table is the executed criminal Aris Kint. Dr. Tulp, the esteemed anatomist, is shown demonstrating the flexor muscles of the forearm, the very ones that allow the fingers to grasp. He holds the forceps in one hand while making a gesture of explanation with the other, his gaze directed not at the body, but at his audience of fellow surgeons. The surgeons themselves are not depicted as passive spectators. They lean in, their faces a study in rapt concentration, their eyes moving between Dr. Tulp, the exposed arm, and a large anatomical textbook in the corner. Rembrandt's genius is in how he captures the intellectual electricity of the moment. This is not a scene of gruesome horror, but one of intense, shared discovery. The light in the painting, a signature of Rembrandt's style, falls most brilliantly on the corpse, turning its pale skin into the luminous center of the composition. The body of the executed thief is, quite literally, a source of illumination. The painting is a powerful piece of propaganda for the new science. It presents the dissection not as a grim punishment, but as a noble and enlightened pursuit. It celebrates the surgeons as men of reason and civic importance. It transforms a macabre event into a moment of collective intellectual achievement. And yet, there is a subtle tension in the work. The corpse, though brilliantly lit, is also partially in shadow, particularly its face, a reminder of the human tragedy that made this lesson possible. The painting, in its very structure, acknowledges the uncomfortable truth that enlightenment is being purchased at the cost of one man's desecration. This masterpiece is just the most famous example of a genre of art that flourished in the Netherlands, the anatomical group portrait. These paintings served as a record of the event and a celebration of the medical guild's civic and scientific role. They are a testament to how central these public dissections were to the cultural and intellectual life of the time. The influence of this anatomical knowledge extended beyond these explicit scenes. It infused all of Western art. When an artist painted a muscular hero or a languid Venus, the convincing sense of flesh and bone, of weight and tension, was often a direct result of hours spent in the anatomy theater, studying the dead. The quest for anatomical realism became a driving force of artistic innovation. It pushed artists to develop new techniques of drawing and modeling, to better understand perspective and foreshortening, all in the service of creating a more convincing illusion of a living, breathing body on a flat surface. This pursuit, however, placed artists in a morally ambiguous position. Like the surgeons, they were beneficiaries of a system that relied on the bodies of the executed poor. They were turning the ultimate degradation of one individual into the ultimate expression of artistic beauty and truth. The sublime grace of a painted saint's upturned face might have been perfected through the study of a hanged man's neck muscles. This uncomfortable relationship is the hidden story behind much of the West's most celebrated art. The realism we admire, the lifelike quality that moves us, was often learned in the stark, odorous environment of the anatomy theater. It reminds us that the pursuit of beauty, like the pursuit of knowledge, is not always a clean or comfortable process. It can be entangled with systems of power, punishment, and profound ethical compromise. So, the next time you stand before a masterpiece of Renaissance or Baroque art and marvel at its anatomical perfection, it is worth remembering the silent collaborators in its creation. Remember the artists sketching in the cold theater, and remember the unnamed men and women on the table whose tragic ends provided the raw material for a revolution in both science and art. Their bodies became the textbooks from which a new vision of humanity was learned. The legal pipeline from the gallows to the anatomy theater, as grim as it was, suffered from a fundamental problem of supply and demand. The laws, like Britain's Murder Act, provided a steady but small stream of bodies. A major city like London or Edinburgh might have a few dozen executions in a good year. But by the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the number of medical schools and private anatomy teachers had exploded. There were hundreds, even thousands, of students in these cities, all requiring practical anatomical training. The legal supply of executed criminals was a mere trickle when a flood was needed. This gaping chasm between the demand for bodies and the legally sanctioned supply created the perfect conditions for a new, illicit, and terrifying trade to emerge from the shadows. This was the era of the Resurrectionists, a grimly ironic name for the men who haunted the graveyards and tore the newly dead from their final resting places. The body snatchers, as they were more commonly known, were the dark entrepreneurs of the anatomical world. They were typically rough men from the laboring classes, often grave diggers or cemetery watchmen themselves, who knew the layout of the churchyards and the rhythms of burial. They understood that a freshly buried body was a valuable commodity, worth a significant sum to a desperate anatomist. The transaction was a clandestine but brutally simple one. The body snatcher would deliver a fresh corpse to the back door of the anatomy school, and the surgeon or his assistant would pay in cash, no questions asked. The price varied depending on the condition and freshness of the subject, with the bodies of children and adults with unique medical conditions fetching a premium. This trade was, for the most part, a legal gray area. At the time, a dead body was not considered legal property. Therefore, while violating a grave was a misdemeanor, stealing the corpse itself was not technically theft. The only prosecutable offense was stealing the coffin or the shroud the body was buried in. Canny resurrectionists learned to strip the body naked and leave the grave goods behind, making their crime incredibly difficult to punish severely. The work of a body snatcher was physically demanding and nerve-wracking. They usually worked in small gangs, under the cover of darkness. The process was swift and efficient. They would dig a hole at the head of a fresh grave, not uncover the whole coffin. Then, using a crowbar, they would pry open the coffin lid. Ropes would be looped around the corpse's neck and under its arms, and the body would be unceremoniously hauled out of its grave. The whole operation could be completed in under an hour. The body would then be stuffed into a sack and transported by cart or wheelbarrow through the darkened city streets to its final destination. The rise of the Resurrectionists spread a wave of terror through the general populace, particularly among the poor, who were most vulnerable. The fear of dissection, already potent, now took on a new and more immediate dimension. It was no longer a fate reserved for murderers. Now, any family who buried a loved one had to live with the sickening fear that their grave would be violated, their relatives' bodies stolen and sold for mutilation on the anatomy table. This terror was not unfounded. The body snatchers were brazen and prolific. In London alone, it's estimated that hundreds of bodies were stolen each year to supply the city's many anatomy schools. Society reacted with a mixture of fear and fury. Families began to take matters into their own hands to protect their dead. Those who could afford it would bury their loved ones in heavy iron coffins known as patents, which were incredibly difficult to open. Others would place a thick iron cage, called a mortsafe, over the grave for the first few weeks after burial, until the body had decomposed enough to be of no value to the anatomists. Cemeteries became fortified places. Watchtowers were erected, and armed guards patrolled the grounds at night. Families would stand vigil over the graves of their recently deceased, sometimes for weeks on end, armed with clubs and firearms. The churchyard, once a place of peaceful rest, had become a battleground. Devices of grim ingenuity were even invented, such as the coffin torpedo, a spring-loaded device buried with the coffin that would fire a charge of buckshot at any would-be grave robber who disturbed it. This state of affairs created immense social unrest. The public's anger was directed not just at the body snatchers themselves, but at the anatomists who created the market for their grisly trade. Surgeons and their students were viewed with deep suspicion and hostility. They were seen as arrogant and immoral, willing to desecrate the dead for their own professional gain. Anatomy schools were sometimes attacked by angry mobs, their windows smashed, and their contents burned. The situation reached its horrifying climax in the 1820s with the infamous case of Burke and Hare in Edinburgh. William Burke and William Hare were not body snatchers, they were murderers. They realized it was far easier and more profitable to create fresh corpses than to dig them up. Over a period of about 10 months, they murdered at least 16 people, lodgers and transients whose disappearance would not be immediately noticed, and sold their bodies directly to the prominent anatomist Dr. Robert Knox. They would ply their victims with alcohol and then suffocate them, a method that left no obvious marks of violence on the body, making it a perfect specimen for dissection. The discovery of their crimes sent a shock wave of horror across Britain. It was the ultimate nightmare realized. The demand for anatomical subjects had become so rapacious that it had spawned a new form of serial killing. The Burke and Hare case made it terrifyingly clear that the existing system was unsustainable. The chronic shortage of legal bodies, coupled with the insatiable demand from the medical profession, had created a monster. It had spawned a violent black market that terrorized the public and had now escalated to murder for profit. The illicit trade in corpses, born in the shadow of the gallows, had shown that a system built on a foundation of punishment and scarcity was destined to lead to barbarism. The public outcry was deafening. The government could no longer ignore the problem. The Resurrectionists and the even more horrifying specter of the Burkers had forced society to confront the deep ethical contradiction at the heart of modern medicine. A new solution had to be found, one that could supply the needs of science without resorting to the gallows or the graveyard. The public horror that followed the Burke and Hare murders was not just a fleeting moment of outrage. It was the culmination of a growing wave of unease, a stirring of conscience that had been building for decades. The age of public dissection, once seen as a symbol of enlightenment and civic order, was beginning to look like something else entirely. A barbaric, inhumane, and deeply uncivilized practice. The arguments of reformers, philosophers, and the general public began to coalesce into a powerful critique that would ultimately help dismantle the entire system. One of the most powerful arguments was simple, human-centered, and moral. Early reformers, including Quakers and other dissenting religious groups, began to loudly question the fundamental ethics of the practice. They argued that every human being, regardless of the crimes they had committed in life, possessed an innate dignity that should be respected, even in death. To subject a person's body to public mutilation and display, they contended, was a form of cruel and unusual punishment that degraded not only the deceased, but also the society that sanctioned it. It was an affront to the very idea of common humanity. This was a radical shift in perspective. For a century, the official narrative had been that the criminal's body was a forfeited object, a resource for the state. The reformers reframed the debate, insisting that the body was still, in some essential way, a person. They spoke of the indignity of the dissection table and the sacred trust of caring for the dead. Their language appealed to a sense of empathy and decency, urging people to see the corpse not as a specimen, but as the poor remains of a fellow human being. This argument was powerfully articulated by the philosopher Jeremy Bentham. Although a staunch utilitarian who believed in policies that produced the greatest good for the greatest number, he was deeply troubled by the practice. He recognized that the intense pain and terror inflicted upon the condemned and their families by the sentence of dissection far outweighed the scientific benefits gained from that specific source of bodies. He argued that the practice created a community of terror, hardening the hearts of the public and associating the life-saving practice of anatomy with cruelty and horror. It was, in his view, a counterproductive and barbaric way to advance science. Another line of attack focused on the spectacle itself. What had once been framed as an educational event was now being condemned as a form of ghoulish entertainment. Critics pointed to the diverse, ticket-paying crowds as evidence that the anatomy theater had devolved into a kind of morbid circus. They described the jeering, the drunken behavior, and the carnival-like atmosphere that often surrounded these events. Was this really about the sober pursuit of knowledge, they asked? Or was it about satisfying the public's basest, most voyeuristic instincts? This critique painted the anatomist performer not as a high priest of science, but as a kind of theatrical showman, profiting from a spectacle of death. The practice was seen as coarsening public morals, making people callous and insensitive to the realities of death and suffering. It was turning a profound and solemn event, the exploration of the human body, into cheap, sensationalist theater. This argument resonated strongly with the emerging middle-class sensibilities of the 19th century, which placed a new emphasis on privacy, decorum, and the sanctity of the family. The idea of a loved one's body being publicly displayed and taken apart became increasingly offensive to this new moral code. Death, it was felt, should be a private, family affair, not a public spectacle. The ideal was now the peaceful, dignified deathbed scene, surrounded by grieving relatives, followed by a somber and respectful burial. The raucous, public, and violent world of the anatomy theater was the very antithesis of this new ideal. The body-snatching crisis added a powerful, practical argument to the moral and social critiques. Reformers could now point to the chaos and terror caused by the Resurrectionists as a direct and inevitable consequence of the existing laws. The system was clearly broken. By legally linking anatomy to the gallows, the state had created the black market that now plagued its citizens. The only way to stop the grave robbers, they argued, was to change the law and provide a different legal source of bodies for the medical schools. This was a pragmatic argument that appealed to lawmakers and property owners. The constant need for cemetery guards, the social unrest, the fear that stalked every fresh grave, these were problems of public order that demanded a solution. The reformers presented a clear choice: either continue with the current barbaric and chaotic system, or create a new, more rational and humane one. These stirrings of conscience were also felt within the medical profession itself. While many anatomists were content with the status quo, a new generation of medical professionals was beginning to feel a sense of professional shame. They wanted to distance their discipline from the taint of the gallows, the spectacle of the theater, and the crime of the body snatchers. They aspired to a more professional, scientific, and respectable image for medicine. They began to argue that the boisterous public theater was not, in fact, the best environment for serious anatomical study. They advocated for private, dedicated dissection rooms where students could learn in a quiet, sober, and methodical way, free from the distractions of a curious and often unruly public. This convergence of forces, moral outrage, shifting social values, the practical crisis of body snatching, and a desire for professionalization within medicine created an irresistible momentum for change. The old justifications began to ring hollow. The idea that public dissection was a noble, enlightening, and necessary practice was collapsing under the weight of its own grim consequences. The curtain was slowly beginning to fall on the anatomy theater. The conscience of a society was awakening to the fact that the pursuit of knowledge, however vital, could not be built upon a foundation of terror, desecration, and a profound disrespect for the dead. The debate was no longer about whether the system should change, but how. The question that now faced lawmakers was a difficult one. If not the bodies of executed criminals, then whose bodies would serve the needs of science? Parallel to the rising tide of public revulsion, another powerful force was working to push anatomy off the public stage and into the quiet of the laboratory. This force came from within science itself. The very nature of medicine was changing. It was becoming more professional, more specialized, and more focused on rigorous, objective research. The boisterous, theatrical, and often chaotic environment of the public anatomy theater was becoming an embarrassment, an anachronism from a less civilized age. The retreat of science from the stage was a gradual but decisive shift, driven by new technologies, new ideas, and a new vision of what it meant to be a medical professional. The 19th century saw the slow but steady professionalization of medicine. The old model of the gentleman scholar or the guild-trained surgeon was giving way to a more standardized, university-based system of education. With this came a new set of professional ethics and values. The ideal was no longer the charismatic performer who could captivate a lay audience, but the sober, detached, and objective researcher. The new heroes of medicine were men who worked patiently in laboratories and clinics, not those who played to the crowd in a theater. From this new perspective, the public dissection looked increasingly unscientific. True scientific inquiry, it was argued, required a controlled environment. It needed quiet, repeatable experiments, meticulous record-keeping, and peer review. The public theater, with its diverse audience, its time constraints dictated by decay, and its emphasis on dramatic presentation, was the very opposite of a controlled environment. It was a place for demonstration, not for deep, systematic investigation. Leading medical reformers began to argue that anatomy should be taught not as a fleeting annual spectacle, but as a core part of the curriculum, with students performing their own dissections in dedicated private laboratories. This hands-on approach was recognized as being far superior for learning than simply watching a demonstration from a distant tier. This shift in pedagogy created an even greater demand for bodies, but it also fundamentally changed the context of dissection. It moved the practice from the public sphere to the institutional sphere, from a civic ritual to a private educational exercise. The goal was no longer to edify the public, but to train a new generation of expert professionals behind closed doors. This retreat was also made possible by crucial scientific and technological advancements. One of the greatest challenges for the old anatomists was the speed of decomposition. The entire multi-day ritual was a race against putrefaction. This urgency necessitated the use of very fresh bodies, which is why the recently executed were so ideal. However, throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, anatomists developed increasingly effective methods of preservation. Early techniques involved injecting the vascular system with alcohol or turpentine. Later, more sophisticated methods using arsenic and other metallic salts were developed, which could preserve a body for weeks or even months. A major breakthrough was the art of wax injection, perfected by anatomists like Frederick Ruisch in Amsterdam. By injecting colored wax into the arteries and veins, they could create durable, vibrant, and incredibly detailed anatomical preparations. These models could be studied at leisure, used for teaching year after year, and they eliminated the smell and unpleasantness of a decaying corpse. This was part of a broader movement towards creating permanent anatomical collections. Anatomists began to create vast museums of specimens, preserved organs in jars, dried preparations of the nervous system, and, of course, articulated skeletons. These collections became invaluable teaching resources. They allowed students to study human anatomy in a systematic and comparative way, without the pressure and logistical challenges of a fresh dissection. While these preparations could never fully replace the experience of dissecting a real human body, they significantly lessened the urgency for a constant supply of fresh corpses. Science was developing a library of the dead. It was building a permanent archive of anatomical knowledge that was not dependent on the executioner's timetable. This shift from the ephemeral event of the public dissection to the permanent collection of the Anatomy Museum was a fundamental change. It represented a move from performance to data, from spectacle to specimen. The focus was no longer on the dramatic unveiling, but on the systematic cataloging and study of the human form. The anatomist's role changed accordingly. He became less of a performer and more of a curator and a researcher, presiding over his silent, ordered collection of human parts. The architecture of anatomy changed as well. The grand, circular theater, designed for an audience, began to be replaced by the modern dissection laboratory, a practical, well-lit, and well-ventilated room with multiple tables, allowing many students to work simultaneously and in private. This new space was designed for work, not for spectacle. It was a functional, institutional room, hidden away within the walls of the hospital or university, deliberately shielded from the public eye. By the early 19th century, the alliance between the state's justice system and the scientific establishment was beginning to fray. Science no longer needed the drama of the gallows to legitimize its work. In fact, that association was now seen as a liability, a stain on the profession's reputation. Medicine wanted to present itself as a clean, modern, and benevolent discipline, dedicated to healing the living, not to participating in the punishment of the dead. The retreat from the stage was, in essence, an act of professional purification. It was science cutting its ties with the executioner and the showman, and establishing its own sovereign private territory. The knowledge that had once been revealed in a dramatic public performance was now to be acquired through the patient, methodical work of experts in a controlled, private setting. The curtain was not just falling on the theater. It was being drawn across the entire discipline, separating the world of medical science from the gaze of the curious public. This retreat, however, left a gaping hole. The moral and professional arguments for ending the old system were overwhelming, but the practical problem remained. Where would the bodies for these new, private dissection labs come from? The stage was empty. The old star performers had retired, but the show, in a new, quieter form, still had to go on. The pressure had become unbearable. The public was terrified of the body snatchers. The reformers were morally outraged, and the medical profession was desperate for a clean, legal, and plentiful supply of bodies to support its new model of education. The old system, relying on the gallows and the graveyard, was a catastrophic failure, culminating in the horrors of the Burke and Hare murders. The British Parliament, finally spurred to action, knew that something had to be done. The solution that emerged was a landmark piece of legislation that would forever change the relationship between the dead, the poor, and the medical establishment. It was the Anatomy Act of 1832. The act was a direct response to the crisis. Its primary stated goal was to end the illicit trade in corpses by providing a new, legitimate source of bodies for dissection. It did this by making a radical and deeply controversial shift. The source of anatomical subjects would no longer be the executed criminal. It would be the unclaimed poor. The law stipulated that any person who died in a hospital, a workhouse, or a prison, and whose body was not claimed by a relative for burial, could be legally handed over to the anatomy schools. It created a new pipeline, one that led not from the gallows, but from the poorhouse. On the surface, the Anatomy Act was a piece of progressive, rational legislation. It officially ended the centuries-old practice of dissection as punishment. No longer would a judge's sentence extend beyond the grave. The link between criminality and anatomy, which had so stigmatized the profession, was legally severed. The act also, in a single stroke, put the Resurrectionists out of business. By creating a legal and inexpensive supply of bodies, it destroyed their black market. The terror of grave robbing that had haunted the nation for decades would finally come to an end. For the anatomists, the act was a monumental victory. It provided them with the steady stream of subjects they had long dreamed of, allowing them to establish modern, well-equipped dissection labs and make anatomical training a standard part of every medical student's education. It was the moment anatomy officially transitioned from a public spectacle into a purely academic discipline, conducted with professional decorum behind the closed doors of the university. But beneath this veneer of rational progress lay a much darker and more troubling reality. The Anatomy Act did not solve the fundamental ethical problem, it simply shifted it. It replaced one class of the powerless, the executed criminal, with another, much larger class, the destitute poor. The law was, in effect, a sentence of dissection for the crime of poverty. The workhouses of 19th century Britain were harsh, unforgiving institutions, designed to be as unpleasant as possible to deter people from seeking public assistance. They were filled with the elderly, the sick, the orphaned, and the unemployed. People with no family or financial resources to fall back on. To die in such a place was to die in a state of ultimate social abandonment. The Anatomy Act added a final, post-mortem terror to this fate. The fear that had once been associated with the gallows was now transferred to the workhouse. The poor came to dread these institutions not just for the miseries they inflicted in life, but for the final indignity they threatened in death. The idea of being handed over to the surgeons was seen as the ultimate pauper's disgrace, a final declaration that your life and your body had been of no value. The popular resistance to the act was immediate and fierce. It was dubbed the Anatomy Bill for the Poor. People saw it correctly as a law that protected the graves of the rich while commodifying the bodies of the destitute. There were protests and riots. The poor went to extraordinary lengths to avoid the fate of dissection. Families would go into debt to pay for a funeral for a distant relative, just to prevent the body from being unclaimed. People on their deathbeds would beg their neighbors to ensure they received a proper burial. Burial societies and clubs became hugely popular among the working classes, with members paying a small, weekly subscription to guarantee that their funeral expenses would be covered and their bodies would be safe from the anatomist's knife. The act created a new and powerful form of social anxiety, a deep-seated fear of what would happen to one's body after death if you did not have the means or the family to protect it. It drew a stark line through society, not just in life, but in death. On one side were those who could afford the dignity of a private burial. On the other were the unclaimed, whose bodies became the raw material for the advancement of a medical science that was often inaccessible to them in their own lives. The Anatomy Act of 1832 and similar laws passed across Europe and America thus marks the end of one era and the beginning of another. It was the definitive end of the age of the public anatomy theater. The spectacle was over. The anatomist performer had been replaced by the anatomy professor, the paying crowd by a class of registered students. The association with criminal justice was formally dissolved, but the transition was far from clean. The new system, while more orderly and scientifically efficient, was built upon a foundation of profound social inequality. It solved a supply problem for the medical profession by systematically exploiting the bodies of the most vulnerable members of society. It quieted the chaos of the graveyard by institutionalizing the appropriation of the poor. The long and uncomfortable history of the relationship between power and the dead had not ended. It had simply put on a new, more professional, and less visible uniform. The silence that fell over the old anatomy theaters was not the silence of a problem solved, but of a problem hidden. The difficult questions about who pays the price for progress and whose bodies are deemed to be for the public good had been moved from the public stage into the quiet, locked rooms of the workhouse and the laboratory. And so, the grand, macabre theater falls silent. The crowds disperse, the anatomist lays down his silver-handled scalpel, and the law rewrites the final act. Our journey has taken us from the ink-stained broadsides of the 17th century to the sterile, private laboratories of the 19th. We have witnessed a profound transformation, a shift from public punishment to private study, from spectacle to science, from the body of the criminal to the body of the pauper. We began with a central question. How did this strange convergence of justice, science, and entertainment ever come to be? The answer, we have seen, is woven from many threads. It was born of a desperate scientific need, sanctioned by a legal system that weaponized fear, and consumed by a public hungry for both knowledge and sensation. It was a product of its time, an era grappling with the monumental shift from a world governed by faith in the unseen to one governed by faith in what could be seen, measured, and mapped. This uncomfortable history teaches us something fundamental about the ethics of progress. It reminds us that the path to enlightenment is rarely clean. The knowledge that forms the very foundation of modern medicine, the anatomical literacy that allows a surgeon to save a life today, was acquired at a profound human cost. It was paid for by the terror of the condemned, the desecration of the dead, and the institutionalized exploitation of the poor. It forces us to ask a difficult question. Does a noble end, like the advancement of medical science, justify ignoble means? There is no easy answer. To condemn the anatomists of the past as monsters is to ignore the genuine life-saving imperative that drove them. Yet to celebrate their work without acknowledging the source of their material is to sanitize a brutal reality. The story of the anatomy theater is a cautionary tale, a reminder that the pursuit of knowledge is always embedded in a matrix of power, and that the costs of progress are rarely distributed equally. And what of the value we place on the human body after death? This history reveals our profound ambivalence. We have seen the body treated as a sacred vessel for the soul, a temple requiring absolute integrity for the resurrection. We have seen it treated as the property of the state, a tool for enforcing justice and deterring crime. We have seen it treated as a scientific specimen, a biological machine to be deconstructed and understood. And we have seen it treated as a commodity, an object to be bought and sold in a grim marketplace. Sacred, political, scientific, commercial. The body has been all of these things, often at the same time. The specter of this history has not vanished. It echoes quietly in the modern world. Think of the traveling exhibitions of plastinated human bodies, which draw huge crowds and generate intense ethical debate. Are they powerful educational tools, allowing the public to see the intricate beauty of their own anatomy in a way never before possible? Or are they a modern, sterile version of the old anatomy theater, turning the dead into a spectacle for profit, raising uncomfortable questions about the origins of the unclaimed bodies on display? The debate is a direct descendant of the one that raged in the 18th century. Consider the ongoing and profoundly important discussions surrounding organ donation and the use of human tissue in research. We now operate within a system of altruistic donation, a model built on consent and generosity. This is the humane legacy of the dark history we have explored. We have moved from a system of appropriation to one of gift. Yet the core questions remain. Who gives consent? How do we ensure that vulnerable populations are not coerced? What does it mean to have true autonomy over our bodies, even after we are no longer here to occupy them? The language has changed from punishment to donation, but the fundamental ethical challenge of sourcing human material for the benefit of the living persists. The journey from the public theater to the private lab, from punishment to donation, is a story of our evolving humanity. It reflects our slow, often painful, struggle to balance the needs of society with the dignity of the individual. It shows our attempts to create systems that can advance knowledge and health without sacrificing our compassion. The ghosts of the anatomy theater are a quiet but persistent reminder. They remind us to handle the dead with care, not just for their sake, but for our own. For in our treatment of the dead, we reveal our deepest beliefs about the value of the living. The silence of the past poses a question to the present. In our own time, in our own quest for progress, who is on the table and who is in the audience? And what story will future generations tell about us?